All right, we're ready to go. Alexander, how are you?
I'm very well. Obviously, with children, one has sometimes the late nights, and last night was an especially late one. But that gives you an opportunity to keep up with what's going on in the world, because obviously, through the watches of the night, one keeps up with the news in the United States, around the world, all sorts of things going on. So, interesting times. Huge row apparently between Blinken and Lavrov in Stockholm. And there's an interesting report today in the Financial Times that they were arguing over dinner, and that all the other governments and foreign ministers were there, and they were listening to this argument between Lavrov and Blinken in absolute silence. There was just a sort of sense of shock across the entire room. That's in the Financial Times, so it's probably correct. So nobody apparently weighed in, interestingly enough, on Blinken's side, and Lavrov gave basically as good as he got, and probably better.
All right. Okay. So, yeah, let's talk about. We'll talk about, I guess, Lavrov and all that stuff. We've
Mm.
got Austria, a
All
lot of
about
stuff going down in
Oh,
Austria, a lot of stuff
absolutely. I mean
in
that
Germany. But we've real
the
quick.
Austrian thing is extraordinary. I mean, I'm beginning. I mean, I'm beginning to lose track of what's happening there. I mean, it's Kurz is
musical chairs.
retired, musical chairs. Kurz is retiring. Schallenberg is stepping down. I mean, what's going on? It's so weird. I mean,
Well, they got a new guy, Karl
yeah,
Nehammer.
yeah, I know
Karl
exactly.
Nehammer is now the new chancellor. And anyway, that was
Wow.
just announced like an hour ago.
Yeah,
Look, we had to push things up a little bit for today. We apologize to
yeah,
everybody that we're starting a little bit early, and we're going to probably have to do a hard stop in, I guess, about an hour.
yeah,
I guess. About
yeah.
Alexander, just let us know when you need to do a hard stop
Absolutely, yeah,
on this live stream, and we're going to do a hard stop. But let's do another proper stream on Monday,
yeah.
1 o'clock London time, 13 o'clock LDN time, and we'll do a proper live stream
A
to
proper
cover
live stream, exactly.
all the news and everything. So
Yeah.
we apologize for this. We apologize for starting a little early, and if we do a hard stop in the middle of everything, apologize for that as well. But
Yeah.
let's get into the news then real
Mm,
quick. And we did want to connect with everybody on this
mm,
Friday because there's a lot of
mm,
news, and
mm.
we love connecting with everybody on these live streams. So
Absolutely.
we have a really good time discussing the news
Yeah.
here. So anyway, what do you want to talk about,
Well,
Alexander? I'm looking in the live stream right now and just going through seeing if there's any topics that people would like us to discuss as well. And very, very quickly, hello to everybody in locals. And someone is shopping today. Andy, can we get you anything today? Andy, how about, I don't need anything. Maybe some Bitcoin, but you can't buy Bitcoin when you're going out shopping. Anyway, good luck to you, Andy, as you're shopping. And hello to everyone in
yeah.
locals, the Duran.locals.com. Alexander, what do you want to discuss? And let me pull out some topics from the live stream as well.
And quickly to say, live streams are the best part of our work, in my opinion. It's the part that I really enjoy. We really enjoy, and of course, I do live streams on locals now every Wednesday, so you can join me there. Quickly, we got lots going on. I mean, there's American politics, where the Biden-Harris administration continues to implode in the polls. We're seeing a migration of Democrats who are pulling out. They don't want to stand in for the midterms because it's looking increasingly like it's going to be an absolute massacre of Democrats in the midterms. So we shouldn't lose sight of the US. Lots going on in the US. Lots of interesting events there. But also, of course, the situation in Europe's getting worse by the day. I'm hearing now that, there really are problems with gas. We're looking very likely at shortages of gas. But at the same time, the Europeans are intent on making the situation worse for themselves. They're getting into an enormous struggle with Russia over Ukraine, a completely unnecessary one. There's no reason to think that anything in Ukraine was going to happen this winter, except for the fact, has lost connection to your camera. Sorry. I don't know what's happened there. Hello?
Maybe maybe a cable came off, or you pressed a button.
Let's see. Oh gosh, this is very weird. It's happening more than once. I think it's more likely Can I just go off and join in again? It might be the best way.
Come off and then jump
Yeah,
right back
I'll
in.
jump back.
Just check your cables. Check your USB. Check your cables. Oh, we had you.
There you go. And I didn't do anything, so it's clearly an internet issue. Okay, so the Europeans are making things worse for themselves because they're going along with a crisis in Ukraine, which is entirely manufactured. It has no reality, and yet they're making things worse for themselves. We've had massive arguments in Stockholm between Lavrov and Blinken, all carried out in public, and China is looking on, watching, enjoying it, because they clearly are. Chinese media are now weighing in on the Russian side, unsurprisingly, and all of this just after another summit meeting in which the Russian, Chinese, and Indian foreign ministers, interestingly, came together, and they had a rather successful meeting. So all sorts of things going on all at the same time. World situation is deteriorating. The move towards a bipolar world is accelerating. Countries like India are starting to hedge their bets. It seems to me that's presumably what that summit with China and Russia was all about. That Indian summit with China and Russia was all about. And in the meantime, at the center of it all, the Biden-Harris administration is imploding. The Europeans are in a mess. They've got themselves in a mess over the certain thing that we can't mention. And of course, we see political crisis in Austria with a sort of round, musical chairs of chancellors. I mean, I'm starting to lose track about who's in charge and who is not. Schallenberg's resigned after just a few days. Somebody else has taken over today. I mean, it's just getting very bewildering. And we have a new government in Germany, which, to my mind, is a car crash waiting to happen. I mean, anyway, it's interesting times. One gets a sense that of an accelerating slide towards deterioration. But there we are.
Yeah, Kurtz is stepping out of politics. He's retiring from politics at the age of 35. Schallenberg lasted 2 months, and now you have the new chancellor and the leader of the party, which is Karl Nehammer, Nehammer. So he is going to be running Austria. Austria is in, of course, this massive lockdown and compulsory you-know-whats, and Germany's also doing this compulsory you-know-whats stuff, as is Greece, and lockdowns and two-tier societies. Anyway, all of Europe is unraveling, and they're clamping down on everybody. Anyway, Alexander, let's just do some lightning round of questions and answers, and I'm just going to pull stuff out from the stream and from locals. And let's start with locals. What's going on in Yemen?
What's going on in Yemen? Yeah, indeed, war, more war, in fact. But the basic story in Yemen is that the Saudis losing. The Houthis are getting are winning ground and winning territory, and the US is is now committed. The Biden-Harris administration has committed to itself to ending support for the Saudi war. Whether that's really the case or not is debatable, but the fact is that the Houthis are winning. The Saudis are now decisively losing. The situation for MBS looks extremely bad. And at one and the same time, there is a humanitarian catastrophe now deepening there because, of course, they are being prodigiously badly hit by the worldwide increase in food prices. So Yemen's situation getting worse, and it's perhaps only a question of time, the way things are looking, before it spills over into Saudi Arabia itself. Now, can I just say, Saudi Arabia is a complex place. The House of Saud gained control of the whole country in the 1920s, 100 years ago. But its rule is apparently resented in some regions. And of course, there's the Shia regions along the coast, the Shia populated regions along the coast, where, by the way, a lot of the oil is produced. And also, it seems that there's some resentment towards them in the two holy cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina, where the Saudis are still seen by some people as outsiders. So, if there's a major challenge to the Saudis from outside, from the Houthis, from Yemen, then we just don't know how that's going to work out. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates is playing a game of its own, and it seems to have quietly annexed or essentially taken control of the important island of Socotra, which is considered by many people to be the gateway both to the Red Sea, where, of course, that leads on to the Suez Canal, and even to the Gulf to some extent. It was a place where you could establish a very important, powerful naval base. The Soviets had a naval base there during the Cold War, the later period of the Cold War, and the British earlier. So the United Arab Emirates is making a big play to take over Socotra, it seems. This is an island, I should stress, that is part of Yemen, and that might complicate relations between the Emirates and Yemen as well. So lots going on in Yemen, a complicated situation, a deteriorating situation, deteriorating from the humanitarian perspective and from the perspective of the war there.
All right, update on Nord Stream.
Right, it's still obviously frozen because I think a thing I want to explain, by the way, I mean, the German regulator has postponed further work on certification until Gazprom has completed its setting up its subsidiary company in Germany. This has been done in order to comply with German law. Now, contrary to what many people think, Nord Stream 2 can actually pump gas into Germany before certification process is completed. There is no law that says it can't do that. So Nord Stream 2 can actually start pumping gas into Germany now. In the event that certification were refused, which nobody believes, then of course the company Nord Stream 2 would have to pay a big fine. But that's not unusual in these kind of situations. I've been involved in regulatory situations where companies start working on operating their business, anticipating that licensing will be granted or certification will be granted. That happens quite regularly. So that's not in itself uncommon. Gazprom has elected to wait until the certification process is completed before pumping gas. And of course, what it's doing as a result is that it's deepening, by refusing to send gas in this way, it's deepening the gas shortages in Europe. Now, I don't think that it's doing that on purpose. I think it's doing that because it realizes that if it started pumping gas before the regulator acted, that would create a massive political stink. And all kinds of people were saying, Gazprom, Russia are disregarding EU and German law, which isn't true. But they've elected to do that because of the political dimensions to this. The political dimensions, therefore, mean that Nord Stream 2 isn't operating. It's now expected to be operating in about 6 months, which means that the Europeans are going to be without gas from Nord Stream 2 through what is increasingly looking like a very difficult winter. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have confirmed that the Russians have essentially refusing to negotiate another gas transit deal post-2025. And there are now hints that they won't negotiate a further gas transit deal, even if Nord Stream 2 is never certified. So Ukraine's days as a transit state are coming to an end unless Europe certifies Nord Stream 2, which it probably will sometime in January. There then has to be a further process taking us up to April, which the European Union is going to have to be involved in. So we're not realistically looking at any gas coming out of Nord Stream 2 before the summer. But unless the Europeans do that, they're going to run out of gas permanently.
Right. Okay. Alan is moderating. Thank you very much, Alan. Good to have you moderating. And Alan has a question. Has Russia offered a gas pipeline to India?
I believe so. And I should say that Putin is traveling to India next week. So he's actually very busy at the moment. He's been unwilling, obviously, to leave Moscow over the last few years. We all know the reasons. He met Biden in Geneva back in June, but that was to some extent an exception. Now he's going to India next week, and then he's going to China to attend the opening of the Winter Olympics. So he's just confirmed that, by the way. So he's going to India, and the likelihood is, I mean, they will certainly be talking gas politics. Of that, there is no question. And of course, that involves things with either with Iran, because a gas pipeline would have to go either through Iran and via Pakistan, or perhaps across the sea into India, if that's going to be the route, if it's going to bypass Pakistan. I can't really imagine that. Or alternatively, and this is the other option, perhaps it's going to have to be via the Hindu Kush across Afghanistan. And that's an interesting prospect as well. Of course, there's always liquefied natural gas, which could be sent from the Arctic. That's a major project. Liquefied natural gas is an enormously powerful tool, but of course, it's more expensive than pipeline gas. Pipeline gas takes a long time to set up. You have to build the pipeline. You have to sort out how the pipeline works. But once you get it going, it's much cheaper to send gas that way than to actually simply send it through liquefied natural gas. But this is definitely being talked about. So let's wait and see what comes out of the meeting with Modi in India in the next few days. He's in India next week, and I'm sure that's top of the agenda.
All right. From Gajabel, can you do a summary of the state of the Russian economy? Reading the Western press, it seems like the Russian economy is about to implode. What is the real situation?
Yeah, always these stories. I mean, it's continuously about this. In fact, it's growing by around 5% this year, and that's steady growth. It's not this up and down growth that you get across the West. You have a surge one day and a decline the next day. And remember, last year, Russia had a much smaller recession than the West did. So steady growth, around 5% growth this year. And the expectation is a long-term increases in growth next year. So the growth rate is the underlying growth rate is anyway gradually rising. The central bank chair, Elvira Navalny, gave an interesting report to the Russian parliament about 2 weeks ago, in which she said that the central bank anticipates that the underlying rate of growth of the Russian economy is going to increase from around 2 to 3% to around 3%, 3 to 3.5%, perhaps eventually 4%. In other words, it's a growing growth trajectory. And the reason is that the Russian government now has massive reserves of cash. They run budget surpluses, which is more than anybody else does. They've piled up reserves both in foreign currency, but also in rubles. And they're now in a position to carry out a major infrastructure spending program. And the governor of the central bank anticipates that that's going to increase the underlying growth rate. Now, I want to stress this is costed and financed infrastructure spending built up from reserves. One problem that Russia has, and it's worldwide, is, of course, that the policies of the Biden-Harris administration have set in train a worldwide inflation crisis, and that's affecting Russia as it is affecting every other part of the world. And the Russian central bank, has responded by doing exactly what the Western central banks are afraid to do. It's actually increased interest rates, and because of concern that rises in inflation are leading to people going into debt, there's a decision being taken now both to limit debt expansion, credit expansion in Russia, and also to compensate people by at the lower end of the scale by raising welfare spending. The Russian government can do that. It's running a budget surplus. It has healthy financial reserves. It's not going to go into deficit either this year or the next. it can finance its infrastructure spending and its welfare increases without going into debt. It runs a stable macroeconomic policy. Instead of talking about it imploding, it looks to be in a better state, to be straightforward about it, than most economies around the world.
All right, Robert, on which channel do you guys prefer that we watch you? You'll get the most content on the Duran.locals.com. I mean, you'll get a lot of content, but we're on every platform: YouTube, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, and Super U as well. You will find us. So choose the platform that you feel most comfortable on. But if you really want to get the most content, just from a content perspective, then Locals is where you'll get that.
Yes.
What's going on in Ethiopia?
Yeah, okay. So talk about America imposing sanctions on the Ethiopian government, and an extraordinary recording of a meeting between US officials and the heads of some of the leading figures in the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. And it's now, I think, become unambiguously clear that the United States is covertly backing the TPLF in its war against the Ethiopian government. Now, that war continues. We were doing a program a short while ago about the TPLF being poised to capture Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. There was talk that they were only a couple of kilometers outside the city. Turns out that wasn't actually true. They're some distance away. And it seems that the war is far from ended, and that the Ethiopian government still has cards to play and is getting some support from other sections of Ethiopian society. So the war continues, but it's now become unambiguously clear that the United States covertly is backing one side in it, which is the TPLF. As I said, there was this extraordinary recording of these American officials talking to the leaders of the TPLF. Some of the language which was used by the American officials towards the TPLF was beyond sycophantic, and it shows that within the civil war, there is a geopolitical conflict also. And the underlying story of the war is, again, this duel in Africa between the United States and China, with the current Ethiopian government seen by many people in Washington as apparently too close to China. I should say that Blinken had a extraordinarily unsuccessful, a humiliatingly unsuccessful tour of Africa about a week ago. He went from African country to African country. He went to Nigeria, for example, trying to persuade them apparently to break their connections to China. And all of them said to him, well, look, we're very happy to work with you, to take your money, to work with the United States. We're all friends of the United States, but we are also friends of China also. So this attempt by Blinken to sort of divide up the Africans was not really successful. And interestingly, I gather Angola, which is one of the key countries the United States wants to win over because it's a major oil producer and it provides a lot of its oil to China, it's apparently decided to resolutely stick with its friendship with China, despite being invited to Joe Biden's Democracy Summit, which would surprise people because it's not, up to now, the West has not regarded Angola as being any kind of democracy, but there we go. So that's a brief summary, not just of the situation in Ethiopia, but in Angola too.
All right.
And Africa too.
What do you think is going to happen between Algeria and Morocco?
Well, there's been more talk of fighting and more talk of war at the moment, and this is, of course, always about Western Sahara. This talk of a conflict never completely happens. I mean, I can remember this going all the way back to the early 1970s. So this is a long-standing dispute and conflict between these two countries. I think that they will each of them draw back. Morocco, of course, is backed by the West and is one of those countries, one of those Arab countries that has established diplomatic relations with Israel and has, by the way, a long history of actual friendship with Israel going all the way back to the 70s. And of course, Algeria considers itself to be, on the contrary, a sort of standard bearer of Arab nationalism. So I think that despite the fact that these two countries have different ideological perspectives, different histories, different traditions. Algeria during the Cold War tended to be more aligned with the Eastern Bloc, Morocco always with the Western Bloc, and some of that's carried over to this day, with Algeria being quite close to Russia, friendly to China. At the end of the day, I think that this conflict, these disputes between Morocco and Algeria are unlikely to tip over into a full-scale war. I would guess, by the way, that if there was a war, which I don't expect, it's probably fairly evenly balanced. Algeria has a much bigger army, a more powerful air force, and those sort of things. But Morocco's military is apparently well trained, by Arab standards at least, and has the backing of the West. So I wouldn't have thought it would be a conclusive victory on either side, and I doubt that it would go beyond border clashes.
All right, super chat from Meganesia Shan. Alexander, what alarms me is that the White House staff think that the national ID documents are nothing more than a luxury.
True. I can't really add to that. It alarms me too. I mean, we're seeing an authoritarian drift now in the West of a sort that I would never have imagined. And what you've just described is another illustration.
All right. Toilet Sauce says, remember that Putin was also in Beijing in 2008 for the Summer Olympics when U.S. advisors told Saakashvili that would be a great moment to start a war. Will history repeat itself?
Possibly, entirely possibly. I mean, as I said, there was this furious row between Putin and Lavrov and Blinken in Stockholm. The Russians have been very clear now. They're unambiguously laying out red lines. There's been another statement by the Foreign Ministry this morning, which I've only just briefly read. I haven't really absorbed it yet. But if there is an attack by Ukraine in the Donbass, and I did a program on my own channel, you can find it on Locals too, in which I said that the Ukrainian army doesn't seem to be in any real shape to carry out such an attack, judging by a report from the London Times. But if it did, then there would be a Russian reaction. The Russians are making it absolutely clear that they're not fazed by all this talk about financial sanctions. The Western powers have essentially admitted that it would be only financial sanctions would be their entire response. The Russians are not worried about that. Lavrov said that to Blinken unambiguously in Stockholm. I would have thought that before Putin goes to China, to China for the Winter Olympics, he will have worked out with his people what they would do in the event that there was such a attack. And I would add that Lavrov, a few days ago, actually explicitly warned Ukraine against doing what Saakashvili did. He actually said, he actually cited the example of Saakashvili, and he said that you should not even consider going down the route that Saakashvili took in 2008. It ended disastrously for him. Georgia was defeated. It lost more territory as a result of that war. Saakashvili subsequently fell, went into exile, and of course he's now in prison in Georgia. So it didn't turn out well for him at all. And if you go down that same route, it won't turn out well for you either. So Lavrov gave that warning to the Ukrainians, but unfortunately it doesn't follow that the Ukrainians will heed those warnings. Zelensky looks like he's in a very tight hole. He could do something desperate. He could start a war. Things could repeat themselves. But if they do repeat themselves, the Russians are ready.
All right, Raphael, thank you for joining the Duran community. Hello, gentlemen. This is my university, not a show. Thank you very much for that, Raphael. And Boris Negrarosa says Operation Barbarossa 2.0 in the making.
Well, not on that scale. I'm not going to say something else. Operation Barbarossa 1 was carried out by the Wehrmacht, the best organized military that Western Europe has arguably ever produced. Operation Barbarossa 2 would be carried out by a Ukrainian military, which is bogged down in the Donbass. And, again, I repeat, you have to read these articles in the London Times. The London Times actually reported a Ukrainian soldier, a squad leader, man, identified by his first name, Vadim, as saying that Ukraine can't win this war. I mean, it's unable to win. And that was a Ukrainian soldier on the front line. And I mean, it came across as a very disorganized, very demoralized army, basically bogged down in trench warfare, with the soldiers there, tied down there for 9 months in very harsh and unforgiving conditions. So, I mean, that doesn't look like a very convincing army. And it was, one is talking about NATO and the NATO military. Well, of course, one shouldn't push these analogies too far, but a NATO military that failed against the Taliban in Afghanistan isn't realistically going to have much chance against the Russian military today, or so it seems to me. And in any event, Blinken and Stoltenberg both issued comments. Stoltenberg in Riga, where there was a NATO foreign ministers meeting, and Blinken in Stockholm, in which they made it pretty clear that if there was a war in Ukraine, NATO would not involve itself. It would not actually do anything. And it was fascinating to see Western journalists clearly disappointed, clearly frustrated, and constantly asking questions, both of Stoltenberg and Blinken, saying, is it really the case we're only going to limit ourselves to financial sanctions? Don't we have any other levers to play? Don't we have any other cards to play? And both Blinken and Stoltenberg basically very grudgingly had to admit that they didn't have any. So Barbarossa 2, but Barbarossa would be a shadow of Barbarossa 1. You could almost say that it would be another case of what Karl Marx once famously said, of history repeating itself. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. It wouldn't be quite a farce, because no war is ever a farce, but it would not be anything like Barbarossa 1.
All right. GEC812 and Cosmic Rain, thank you for joining us and moderating. We really appreciate it. And let's jump into locals. And we have a question here. What will historians of the future make of the EU project and its effort to impose a uniform political structure and a homogeneous European IKEA culture upon the continent? IKEA seems a fitting metaphor for the EU in many respects.
Historians are going to analyze and discuss and debate this relentlessly. And they're going to ask themselves repeatedly, however did it happen that a project so unreal, so utopian, so crazy was ever launched and was ever pursued in this sort of way? I mean, that's what they're going to say to themselves. How did it happen that an economic community of nations, which is what the EU, the European Economic Community, originally was, which worked well and which worked well until the 1980s, how it converted itself into this bizarre construct that we have today, and how it was persisted in for so long. And they will be, historians of the future will be looking at this and trying to understand it. And they will find it very difficult too, because it's always very difficult to understand from a future perspective, from the perspective of hindsight, ideology-driven projects such as this one is.
All right. Toilet Sauce says, remember all the fuss about space debris caused by the Russian missile test? The ISS just had to adjust its orbit in order to dodge U.S. space debris, while last week there was a near miss with some space debris from SpaceX.
Well, indeed. And in fact, Putin made exactly that point. He said, people are talking all the time about our anti-satellite test. Well, the US has, tested anti-satellite weapons in the past. There's only an amount of space debris out there. This is an entirely concocted and fabricated thing. He said this, by the way, in this forum with international investors when he was asked some of these questions. And I mean, his comments about it all was absolutely scathing. And you're absolutely right. I mean, that's entirely correct. There's heaps of debris out there, and what the Russians have done has barely added to anything. This was just another PR stunt, which we got from the State Department.
Okay, Raphael says in a super chat here, guys, watching Putin and Biden all week long, simply on presentation, participation, we can determine who is winning, who has confidence. Putin is.
Well, of course it is. I mean, absolutely. He's getting more confident, by the way. I mean, this is. I mean, the point we've just been making, Alex and I, in our various programs, is that the fact that Putin is now able to not just set out red lines, but actually insist that the Western powers, the United States, NATO, actually agree to a binding treaty is a strong indication. In fact, it's a conclusive indication that he feels that the trends, the underlying geopolitical and economic trends, what the Russians still call the correlation of forces, is tilting in his favor and in Russia's favor. Now, if you're talking, that's about country versus country. But of course, if you're talking about leaders, if you're talking about presidents, about personalities, well, Putin is, of course, preparing for another marathon press conference, 4 or 5 hours. When did, dear Joe ever do anything like that? I mean, never. I mean, if you're talking about them as persons, I mean, there's just no contest. Never has been. I mean, you only have to look at the dynamism, vitality, mental energy of the one and contrast it with the, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, decrepit condition of the other. And the contrast is stark.
Yeah. Alan Watson says, reports on the conflict on the Iran border with the Taliban. Any comment? Actually, Alan, we have a video for that going up most likely Sunday. An in-depth video on the conflict between Iran and the Taliban, the border skirmishes.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the underlying story is of a very, very bad situation in Afghanistan itself. The country is heading into some kind of major economic and humanitarian crisis, and that's creating tensions now. Tension on the border with Iran. The Iranians and the Afghans are trying to patch it up in some way, but the situation in Afghanistan is looking very bleak. And, we're going to see massive migrant flows over the next few weeks and months. And no one is preparing for it. Watch our video and you'll see we discuss it in a much more in-depth way there.
Yeah, from Freedom Autopsy. What about the Senator Obama and Senator Lugar, who promised to protect Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for the Ukrainians giving up nuclear weapons? Ukraine was stabbed in the back by Obama.
Well, of course it was. I mean, the whole point about that, this was all the way back in the 90s after the Soviet Union fell. The idea was that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons, something that the US wanted, by the way, at that time, because, of course, Ukraine having nuclear weapons created another nuclear-armed state, and the United States doesn't want to see too many nuclear-armed states around the world. So it wanted that. And the idea was, the deal that was done was that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons. Russia and the West would accept it within its borders, but at the same time, Ukraine itself would not take sides between the two sides. It would be essentially neutral. And then, of course, in 2013, 2014, Obama and his henchmen orchestrated these events in Ukraine. They tried to pull Ukraine towards the West. Ukraine had already been promised NATO membership, something which the Russians are now unambiguously saying they consider completely unacceptable. And as a result, we are in a situation where Ukraine, without its nuclear weapons, obviously, finds itself in a desperate hole. I was looking at some of the economic figures for Ukraine, and they are dire. I mean, this is a country that has never recovered to the level that it had during the period of the Soviet Union. It's actually going backwards, and it continues to do. and the economic crisis is accelerating. It's got a war on its eastern borders. There's a political crisis in Kiev itself. And what Obama did to Ukraine has comprehensively destabilized it and created a crisis in Europe.
All right. GEC says, loving the Duran's historical series about Russia and the rise of the Bolsheviks. Amazing how events from 1905 eerily similar to more recent events. Thanks.
Well,
and we
absolutely.
will have another show
Another one
tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Same time. Same time tomorrow. I believe it's 7 Eastern. I don't know what time that is, London time. Maybe 2 o'clock London time, I guess.
I think.
Oh, no, wait, not 7 Eastern.
9 is it 9 p.m. I think.
Yeah.
Oh, whatever. And then it might be whatever. Oh, is it in
Yeah.
the morning? Oh, 700 Eastern, is it all?
Yeah.
Anyway, whatever.
Anyway, I get the times turned around. I think 7. I think 7 my time. 7 o'clock my time. Yeah. Anyway,
Right.
same time as usual. Just
Yes.
there. Yeah. Kurt Fram, just want to wish all a great weekend, and don't forget to sing in the lifeboats in the world gone crazy. Yes. Well said, Kurt, and thank you for that as well. Would the Ukrainian army in the trenches actually go on the offensive if ordered to? I think there would be mass defections, refusal to follow orders, mutiny even.
I have to say, reading these articles in the London Times, there's 2 of them. I mean, to be frank, the idea of this army going on the offensive is almost unreal. I mean, obviously, there's no doubt there's some units that are very militant that would respond, and no doubt there's also armored formations in the rear that would try to do something like that. But the army as a whole just doesn't look like it's in good shape at all. And I suspect that if there was an offensive, it would disintegrate very fast.
Okay. Let's see. Cosmic Rain says, hey, lads, just to let you know, I got my Duran hoodie today, and I love it. It will keep me nice and warm. Thank you very much, Cosmic Rain. I've got my Duran hoodie on today as well. And we have a super chat from Danny. Will Belarus eventually be absorbed into the Russian Federation, do you think?
Well, in economic terms, increasingly it is. I mean, one of the paradoxes of Western pressure on Ukraine is that the Lukashenko government, which had previously tried to take a position midway between Russia and the West, is now tilted completely to Russia. So economically, it's now being fully integrated into the Russian economy. We've now had, basically the Russians involved in Belarusian industry, in agriculture, in every conceivable sector to a degree that was completely unheard of. We've had Lukashenko saying that he's now going to meet Putin in Crimea, essentially recognizing Crimea as part of Russia. And we've even had Lukashenko coming out and saying that if NATO moves nuclear weapons into Poland, then Belarus will ask Russia to move Russian nuclear weapons into Belarus. So, I mean, it's astonishing to see how this policy has completely upturned itself. I don't think that for the moment, outright political absorption is on the cards. I think the Russians are happy with the direction of events. They don't want to actually go ahead and, if you like, unite Belarus to Russia, to the Russian Federation, to absorb Belarus completely into the Russian Federation, because I think that they are concerned that if they did that, that might create some concerns among some of the other former Soviet states, including Soviet states that are friendly to Russia, like Kazakhstan, for instance. But to all intents and purposes, economically, that's already happening. And in terms of military structures, it's happening also. And it's entirely the product of Western policy. They made an attempt last year to engineer a regime change operation in Belarus, which failed. They tried a coup attempt earlier this year, which failed as well. That coup attempt apparently was also to involve an attempted assassination of Lukashenko. Something which, by the way, it's important to stress, the Western powers have not denied. The Russians and Belarus have said this was what was being prepared. Nobody in the West has come forward and said that wasn't actually going to happen. So we must assume, since this is uncontested, that that was the plan. So what we've seen is Belarus integrating with the West. And John Bolton is writing articles in the Daily Telegraph saying that, what a disaster this is and how everything's going wrong and what a terrible thing it is that Belarus is doing that. And the only solution he can come up with, remember this is John Bolton, is he says that the United States and the European Union should bribe Lukashenko to step down and offer him some kind of villa in the south of France where he could retire. A kind of offer which, of course, Lukashenko would reject with disgust and which shows the utter bankruptcy, to my way of thinking, of the foreign policy of the neocons.
All right. So from Juan Doe, so the EU is basically a pro-Christian bed.
Yes, very good.
Yes, exactly.
Procrustes, for those who don't know, is a character in Greek mythology. He was a king in one of the states in central Greece, and he had a bed which was a kind of rack where he used to torture people. If they were too long for the bed, he used to chop them up, and if they were too short, he would stretch them. And Theseus, who was the king of Athens, came along and basically overthrew him and put a stop to his cruelties. But the expression Procrustean bed has persisted ever since.
Yeah. From Susie Q, has there been any responses or comments from the U.S. on the joint statement from China and Russia about the democracy conference?
Nothing. Absolutely zero. They pretend it didn't happen. The fact that the Russian and Chinese ambassadors to the U.S. made this statement is astonishing in itself. The US and indeed the media in the US and in Britain and elsewhere are pretending that it didn't happen. This despite the fact that the statement took the form of a letter to National Interest, which is, of course, a US magazine which did admittedly publish it. But he published it, National Interest published it, and it sort of dropped away almost immediately. So the US ignores it. The media ignores it. Most people have not heard about it.
All right. From Mark Hewitt, the EU will use the Northern Ireland Protocol to force the UK to follow their lockdown rules. Is that why Bojo is keeping quiet man on the matter?
Well, I think possibly. It's fascinating to see how, on the one hand, relations between Britain and the EU are deteriorating because, of course, Bojo is pushing back and that he's now involved in a massive quarrel with the integrationist in chief, who is Emmanuel Macron. Macron has called Bojo a clown in charge of a circus. I mean, things have become poisonous between the two, venomous between the two. But at the same time, within Britain, you have the other part, which is the tug from the British establishment, which, of course, wants a reconciliation with Europe and is pushing very hard for it. So Britain is very conflicted at the moment. You have the Bojo, Johnson, and the people around him pulling one direction, the rest of the establishment pulling in the different direction, and you get the sense that Johnson's political authority is weakening.
All right. From Hey Man, couldn't China only accept Bitcoin instead of cash?
Well, the Chinese don't like Bitcoin. In fact, they're doing everything they can not to have Bitcoin. So for the moment, the Chinese policy is not to go with Bitcoin. We'll see how long that continues, but that's
China's
their policy.
made a big mistake.
Yeah,
that's probably going to be one of the biggest mistakes China has ever made, is going after Bitcoin. Very big mistake.
Yeah,
gigantic mistake, to be quite honest. But hey, they made this mistake. Really bad move. Rich says the world should thank Vladimir Putin for saving the world from American trained and funded jihadists in 2015. In some moves, he saved Europe, Asia, and Africa.
Well, yes, I completely agree with you. But of course, you won't find anybody who will say that. I mean, that's absolutely nothing that you will hear anybody in the West say. Most people in the West, Western governments, continue to say that it was a great tragedy that Russia intervened, saved this Syrian government, and prevented these heroic rebels from winning and achieving their revolution. I mean, the reality, of course, is exactly what you said. I mean, had the Russians not intervened when they did, well, we would have had I have no doubt about it, ISIS in Damascus by December 2016. I mean, that was where it was going. And in fact, it was because of that that the Russians intervened. I remember reading in 2017 the Russian ambassador to Britain saying that the Russians had actually been told by the Western powers that they anticipated that that was what was going to happen. And the Russians said to the Western powers, well, what are you going to do about, not 2016, sorry, 2015? What are you going to do about that? What are your feelings about this? Do you really want to see ISIS in Damascus? And apparently the Western diplomats the Russians were engaged with simply shrugged their shoulders. And when the Russians saw that, they decided that they would act, and they intervened, and they intervened to stop it, which they did. And frankly, the world should be grateful, but the Western part of it is not.
All right. From Italy is probably the only major European nation to avoid any terror attacks in the last 40 years. Their intelligence and immigration policy has saved them, but now Draghi comes.
Well, indeed. I'm not sure it's true, by the way, that there haven't been any terrorist attacks or problems of that kind. But it's perhaps nonetheless true that they've had far fewer than some places. Germany, Britain, and of course France. France, worst of all.
The Draghi statement is true.
Well, the Draghi statement is definitely true.
Biscuit Rage says nationalist Ukraine wants to join the EU. The EU mission is the dismantling of European nations, people, cultures, customs, and traditions. Thoughts?
Well, I mean, that's true, and it's also true that the EU enterprise is to expand endlessly and relentlessly until every European state is part of it, except of course Russia. Russia has been told they can't ever join, so so that's part of the mission. I mean, it's one of the things that is destroying the EU. I mean, there's many things that are destroying the EU, but one of it is the visceral Russophobia of the people who are in charge of it. I mean, they've been trying to build the EU against Russia, which, of course, to anybody who knows history, dooms the enterprise from the start. Because the one thing that's been unambiguously clear ever since the early 19th century is that every single attempt to construct a European architecture against Russia ends in failure. Napoleon's, the Kaisers, the Germans during the Second World War. I don't mention the person who was leading Germany then, because sometimes YouTube gets a bit nervous about it, but you all know whom I mean. And of course, it always ends badly, ultimately. But that doesn't seem to stop people wanting to try.
All right. Will you do a focus on Syria and Iraq in the near future?
Absolutely.
We'll take a look. We do a lot of focus actually on Syria.
We do.
To be quite honest, but
absolutely,
yeah,
we do.
We'll definitely take a look at that. From where am I here? 1 second. From Rocky Lux, could it please be clarified under international law terminology whether the status of Crimea is retrocession and not annexation?
Well,
what about
you
accession?
you have to look at the advisory opinion on Kosovo, which the Western powers lobbied the International Court of Justice in The Hague to produce. And the International Court of Justice said that the secession of a territory like Kosovo, and by extension Ukraine, is a valid exercise of self-determination. And that's what it said. Now, the Western powers are extremely embarrassed by this. So, of course, they don't talk about the advisory opinion on Kosovo anymore. And Putin brings it up all the time. And he says that in light of what he said, you can't argue that what happened in Crimea is contrary to international law. I know many jurists agree with him. But, of course, as I said, the Western powers simply refuse to address that issue. They won't talk about it. They refuse to acknowledge that argument even exists.
All right, Cosmic Rain, did I get your? I think I got your super chat, Cosmic Rain. But let me know if there was another super chat that I missed. But I think I got it with the hoodie. Just let me know in the chat if I got the super chat that you're referencing. From Adam, is the EU becoming fixed on UK regime change? If the EU scrap TCA, it is self-harm, but a UK recession or bad EU relations may split Tories to oust Boris.
Absolutely. I mean, that's entirely correct. I mean, the EU wants to see Boris fall, and they're going to do everything they possibly can to help bring that about. And by the way, so does the Biden administration. I mean, let's not have any doubts about this. Biden doesn't like Boris. I mean, this is quite clear. They met in Cornwall during the G20 to G7 summit, but they're not friends, and they don't see eye to eye on things. You remember there was this new Atlantic Charter that they'd come up with. that's already vanished. I mean, I can't think anybody now refers to it anymore. But anyway, so there is definitely an agenda to get Boris in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris, in Washington, and of course amongst quite a few people in London also. I will say there's just been a by-election in Britain where in a Conservative seat, a place called Bexley, and there'd been some speculation that the Conservatives would lose in Bexley. This is a seat that's consistently voted Conservative, but it's the kind of seat where there's a major turning against a government. In a by-election, there's often big swings against the governing party. And it didn't happen. The Conservatives held on, and they held on comfortably. And I think that's going to help Boris quite a lot, because it shows that despite everything, the British electorate are looking at the alternative that Labour is offering, and they don't like it. And the Labour vote only increased very marginally, or rather the share of the vote that the Labour Party has increased only very marginally, which at this point in an election cycle is really bad news for them. And it shows that they're just going backwards.
All right, from Peter, do you think that Sputnik will be approved by the EU and the WH?
Perhaps sometime next century. I mean, the story there. I'm going to say this straightforwardly. I mean, I'm not supporting any medication. I mean, I don't have that kind of knowledge. I'm not making any view about this. But this whole episode is a disgrace. I mean, it's been protracted to ridiculous levels, and it's been done by an unholy coalition. I'm going to say it straightforwardly, of anti-Russian political lobbying from Western governments and big pharma, who don't want to rival. So I mean, that's what's happened. I mean, maybe eventually, some point when all this is, I won't say over, but anyway, in abeyance, maybe it will be approved. But it's taken so ludicrously long that it's, as I said, it's an appalling business.
Yeah,
despite the fact that, as I said, the scientists don't have given this medication the rubber stamp of approval, so there doesn't seem to be any reason why it shouldn't be approved. But it won't be anytime soon.
Rich, for the last 30 years, Japan is stuck with their American allies when all that ally has done for them is stop their economic growth, a Stockholm syndrome.
Well, can I just say, that's true, of course, for the last 30 years. We mustn't overlook the fact that between about 1950 and the mid-1980s, Japan's economy grew at an incredible dynamic speed. If you see some of the old films that the great Japanese director Akira Kurosawa did, set in early 1950s Japan or 1940s Japan, you will see how dire and desperate the situation in that country was then. So one can't say that, taken as a whole, the association of Japan and the United States has been a bad one for Japan. It is the case that around 1990, Japanese economic growth was stopped in its tracks, and that's largely a result of changes in economic and trading relations forced on Japan by the United States. But it is still the case that Japan has a very high standard of living, and the highest standard of living in East Asia. I mean, I know people who travel there, and that's what they tell me. But in my opinion, ultimately, you are right. I think now Japan has outgrown the United States, and this alliance with the United States is becoming a drag and a burden, where once upon a time it had been a benefit. And I think what's keeping Japan in this alliance is this fear of China, and this Japanese fear that China is going to overtake Japan as the major economic power in East Asia, that one day China will overtake Japan economically and even in terms of living standards. And this is something that the Japanese find very difficult to accept. And they have a long, difficult history with China. And for that reason, they're sticking with their alliance with the US. And I think that's going to continue for the time being. I mean, I don't really see that changing. So I agree. I think objectively, this is beginning to work against Japanese long-term interests, but there are reasons why the Japanese are sticking to this alliance for the moment, and I don't think they're going to drop it anytime soon.
All right. Roses and Tea says, regarding Italy and terrorism, there was an attack at Fiumicino in December 1985. I was waiting with my friend for my mother to land there. We had just driven up when people started pouring out screaming.
Well, there you go. I mean, I mean, you know, and of course, Italy had a major terrorist problem in the 1970s. There was a domestic one with the Red Brigades, as I very, very well remember. If we're looking at jihadi terrorism, perhaps there's been less of it in Italy than in some other places, but I don't think one can afford to be complacent, and certainly Draghi's policies aren't going to help.
All right. Zariel is also in the house moderating. Thank you very much, Zariel. How much time do you have, Alexander?
Well, I reckon if we can continue for another 10 minutes, that would be I could do that without running
Okay.
into severe problems.
Alan wants to know, will Boris last a year?
Problematic. Will he last out the winter? But then you never know with Boris. I mean, he's been on the ropes, and then suddenly things turn out well for him, and he comes back fighting. And as I said, he's received a shot in the arm, I think, with this by-election result, which, as I said, many people had been expecting would be a disaster for the Conservatives, and it turned out otherwise. I'm going to say it straightforwardly. Boris Johnson has one great ally, who is Keir Starmer, who is the leader of the opposition Labour Party. He is so unconvincing that it still keeps a lot of support for Boris amongst the Conservatives. And there is, of course, also still a lot of support for Boris in the country, the wider country, because he's still seen as the person who delivered Brexit and who is the guarantee that Brexit is for real. So he still has cards left to play. It hasn't looked very strong over the last few weeks, but we'll see how things pan out.
All right. How long will Biden and Harris last?
If I knew the answer to that one, I'd be a rich man, because I'd be putting my money very quickly. I don't know. I think Biden has just said that he's going to run again in 2024. I don't think anybody really believes that. I think that the fact that he announced that is a clear sign. For me, what it signaled was that they've decided that Kamala Harris is not going to be the successor, that she's not going to run. So effectively, that announcement closes off the window for Kamala Harris in 2024. What they've now got to do is to find some way of finding someone else who can take her place. And some people talk about Pete Buttigieg. I can never get his name completely right. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. There's a cottage industry which you're starting to see in Britain, by the way, which is once again talking up the possibility of Michelle Obama. Just saying.
Yeah, Michelle Harris. That's the ticket. Can Biden continue if the Dems lose the House?
Yeah, well, indeed. Well, indeed. And it depends, of course, by how much he loses. And bear in mind, there are some people in the Republican Party who are very angry. I mean, I don't mean the Mitch McConnell wing, but there are some people who are very angry about what happened during the Trump years, the 2 impeachments, the concerns, Russiagate, other concerns about 2020, which we have to avoid talking about, I'm afraid. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw an impeachment, another impeachment, if the Republicans win big. It's possible.
Yeah. Let's see here. Thomas super chatted. Another stream, you mentioned a book about the WW2 German social plan for Europe, which then revived in the 50s as the EU. Can you remember its name?
Yes,
I
it's
promised that I would get back to people on that book, and
you certainly
I
did, and it's called Hitler's Europe. And if I can just find the Hitler's Europe, it's a particular book that I have, Hitler's Europe: Nazi Rule in Occupied Europe, and it's also on Kindle, and it's by Mark Mazower. Mark, M-A-R-K, Mazower, M-A-Z-O-W-E-R. Hitler's Empire. That's what that is correct title. Hitler's Empire. Nazi rule.
You just said the name. You just said the name that you couldn't say about like 10 minutes ago.
I know. Well, I mean, sorry. Hitler's Empire, Nazi rule
7 times
in occupied Europe. It's on Kindle, and it's by Mark Mazower. M-A-Z-O-W-E-R.
It's just the name of the book, YouTube. Just the name of the book.
Just the name of the book, yeah.
All right. Okay, that is everything. We've gotten all the
wow,
all the super chats, all the questions there. Join us on Monday, everybody.
Absolutely.
Once again, Monday we'll do another live stream, a more in-depth live stream on Monday, and also tomorrow we have our Russian Revolution show as well.
Absolutely.
Heyman's super chat says it was all quality of life America provided for its people in France that won it the first Cold War. The problems aren't external; it's dreams of empire.
You're totally right. That's so correct. And I would add to that, American political institutions, the Constitution, the system of government of the United States, the nature of American political system, which conferred this enormous stability within the United States, and which was so attractive to people around the world. And the way that is being degraded is throwing away America's most powerful asset.
All right. Can you send me that link, Alexander, on Telegram after the stream, or just pop it in right now of the book, so I can also put it into.
I will indeed
as well.
I will indeed. Absolutely. I will do that. I will do that as we speak. Okay.
Yeah, you'll put that in. All right.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
Let me just do one final check. Yep, everything is good. Thank you to our moderators, Cosmic Rain, Zarael, GEC, Alan Watson. And did I get the moderators? Yeah, I think I got the moderators as well. Thank you to everyone that joined us for this quick but very informative live stream. And we will catch you tomorrow with the premiere as well. And we will catch you on Monday. And let me just pop in the link for everybody to have it as well on Locals, the Duran.locals.com. Let me put that link, and I'll put that link in the chat as well for everybody to have the link for that book on Amazon. That link right there. So everyone that's interested in that book, there is the link for it. All right. Any final thoughts, Alexander?
Well, I said we're living in very interesting times. This is the politics of a very difficult and very dangerous transition period. We're going from a multipolar system from a unipolar system to a bipolar system. The blocks are being formed. They're setting out their red lines. At the same time, in the middle of that, and what makes this particularly complicated, is that we have an internal crisis within one bloc, and that is the Western bloc. It's finding it very difficult to adjust to this, and we also see that the dreams of empire that still exist there, and the utopian fantasies that went with it, some people are finding it impossible to give up on them. So we're in a very difficult, very dangerous, very tricky transition period. Once we're through it, if we're all still around, which I suspect we will be, but it's going to be dangerous and worrying, then we will see stabilization. Sorry, one thing, a frog in my throat, but a difficult time and a particularly difficult and very dangerous winter.
Get some water.
will.
You got some water, some tea?
I have some. Well, I had some tea here, but
From your mug?
from my mug.
All right, we'll sign off, everybody, and I will catch everybody on the chat tomorrow, actually, as well, for the premiere of the show. And then we'll see you on Monday. We have a lot of videos coming out this week as well. Take care, everybody.